Well, good afternoon. Thanks for coming to this talk. Today I'm going to talk about decision making in the ICU. So, what we have is not a trivial task. We have to make decisions and a lot of judgments where there's a lot of uncertainty and risk, and yet we know very little about the process of how we handle information and make decisions. Most of us have been acculturated in this process, probably during an internship, and kind of this process that looks like March Madness, where we take a huge array of possibilities, whether they're diagnosis and treatment, and then whittle them down to a couple options and then make decisions between them based on key attributes, risks, benefits, alternatives, and likelihood of being the correct approach. The problem is this is really not what we do. Rather, a lot of what we decide is based on our intuition. And in fact, there are two processes that are thought to characterize human decisions. This is the March Madness compare the alternatives approach, which actually is very slow and computationally intensive and doesn't work very well during periods of high stress because it takes a lot of energy to use. The other approach is, and these are called System 1 and System 2, the other approach is System 1, where when we become familiar with a situation, we can actually process information very quickly based on patterns that we've recognized before in prior experiences. So this is seen in chess masters who've memorized tens of thousands of different board patterns and know exactly just how to behave based on them and aren't really computing individual probabilities of moves. And perhaps folks like you who recognize different kind of cardiac or device failure modes from familiar patterns and just kind of know what to do without considering all the different pieces individually. So when faced with circumstances requiring an action or an answer, your brain will take the most appropriate pathway. So if it's kind of a new process that you're considering, the slower, more computationally active process might be the one that you take. Whereas if something is much more familiar, then you can probably process that pretty quickly. So intuition in this case isn't just like a Yoda sense, but rather the use of different kinds of mental shortcuts that were experimentally discovered. And these are called heuristics. And heuristics are operations or methods that the brain uses to take a difficult question and arrive at an acceptable solution. So the names listed here are given to those that seem to be the most reproducible, and some are self-explanatory, but some are not so much. So it's worth looking into some of these because if you could recognize their use in your own practice or in the practice of others, you might be able to work around some of their pitfalls and come up with better decisions, or at least have a way of kind of troubleshooting some of the processes that might lead to erroneous judgments. So we'll take kind of a fun example. We'll consider my neighbor here. She's 38. She drives a Toyota Prius. She's got a rainbow sticker and a bunch of others from Progressive Causes. She's got this organic food drop at her house on Saturdays, and tons of like-minded people come to this. So what do you think she does? What's probably her profession here? Which one of these seems to represent my neighbor the best? Well, when given this problem to a number of colleagues, they choose this one, which makes kind of sense. And this is a case of representativeness. And this is what that our brain uses to judge the likelihood of a entity A belonging to a category B. And it's driven by impressions, past experiences, and stereotypes, but ignores the base rate frequency of your choice versus other options. And so what's the most probable choice here? It actually isn't the New Age bookstore owner. It's someone working in the software industry, because that's what people do in our neighborhood. There are a bunch of software engineers. Google employs about 30% of the population. So let's look at another heuristic. This is pretty interesting. This is called anchoring. And this was identified based on observations showing that if you mention something, say for example a diagnosis, people will hold on to that as being real, even if you've completely disproven it before. It also exists when people are just given numbers and they sort of, when estimating probabilities, if they hear like a large number at about the time they have to make a decision, they will actually skew their decisions or their estimate of probability to a higher value. And one particularly interesting experiment related to this is when trial judges were asked to roll die before handing out sentences. And those sentences that were given after a large number was shown on the die were actually, those sentences were longer than those handed out when the die showed smaller numbers. And this had no bearing on the duration of practice of the judges that were doing this. So it turns out to be just like a basic human fallibility that's out there that can be exploited by just completely subconscious processing. So we wonder why our patients prefer to have receive full code care sometimes when they, their overall conditions aren't all that survivable. Well, they might be anchoring from some of their experiences watching television shows where their survival is at least twofold greater than any of the other series shown in the world. Another heuristic is availability. And this is the tendency to base decisions based on kind of really memorable events, cases that have burned you, M&M discussions that might have happened that morning. And so kind of a classic example of this one is after the attacks of 9/11, many people consider it a lot safer to not fly in airplanes, even though commercial aviation's got a great safety record. But rather they took road trips the following summer. And in that case, it turned out to be a less safe mode of travel, and a lot more people were killed or injured as a result of that kind of travel, all kind of based on their probability of risk, based on kind of a very vivid image. Unpacking is a tendency to overestimate probabilities or likelihood events when more elaboration is given to back that up. So, for example, if I have to convince a radiologist to allow me to get a head CT, if I give some basic description like evaluate for altered mental status, they might deny that request. Whereas if I unpack some diagnoses like scan the brain to rule out a glioma, post-infarct hemorrhage, or septic emboli, even though I've emphasized entities that are way lower probability than just the general basket of things that might cause mental status, they will attribute a lot more importance to that second one and more likely to approve that scan. And I don't know if that's kind of a lame example, but I mean, generally when you elaborate on something, often that the probability of what you're talking about seems to rise in people's minds. And so this is a problem because different descriptions of the same event may lead to completely different impressions and actions. Status quo bias is our tendency to kind of favor a course of action that's already in motion and not want to rock the boat. And so some of this might be, derived from our view of like first do no harm. And so we have kind of a tendency toward omitting actions rather than committing actions. And I think there's part of human nature, especially medicine, that feels like we are less fallible for things that we just don't do versus things that we actually do. So sometimes not acting is a better way of going. This was explored in an article in Chest a few years back, which is kind of interesting. They're given a case of a very low probability pulmonary embolus where, and then asked, hey, would you like to get a CT of this patient before you send them home? And really kind of the guidelines-based answer is no, it's not indicated. And so very few obtained the CT when asked if they would order it. And yet when the same problem is presented, just with the final line saying, oh, and by the way, the ER ordered a CT on this patient, do you want to go ahead and just get that CT? Because the action was to cancel something, twice as many just were ordered because people just wanted to go with the flow and stick with the status quo. A similar but somewhat different example was given to people when asked, hey, would you put a central line in to give pressors to this woman who's got florid urosepsis, refractory hypotension, obviously needing pressors? And most said they would go ahead and place the line. And yet, when the same problem was presented to a different group, and with a caveat at the end saying, oh, and by the way, she's got a 20 gauge in her hand, and the ER has started norepinephrine infusing through that, and that's helping her blood pressure. In that case, about half as many people opted to put the central line in, which again is sort of like kind of a more guideline-based way of managing this kind of patient. And again, kind of erring on the side of omission and the status quo turned out to be, in many minds, the preferred course of action. So individual cognition can often lead to the wrong diagnoses, but there are more forces ranging from organizational and structural dynamics and interpersonal dynamics, both positive and negative, that can influence medical decision making. And so these are certainly the heuristics, the ones I listed, and plus a number of the others aren't the only things that influence our decisions. So paying attention to hierarchy and groupthink are also turns out to be pretty important too. So the purpose of the last section was just to give you some flavor for some of the different heuristics that underlie intuition and some of the ways that we make decisions. So all of those fall under System 1. These are just rules that help us go from a problem to a decision very rapidly. Naturalistic decision-making studies have found this to be actually kind of a strength of our thinking, that we can make decisions without being aware of them, and often they're quite correct. But at the same time, again, these biases can lead to incorrect or lower probability solutions. So there's also some key interpersonal environmental factors that can affect the use of these different pathways, and these actually, I do think, deserve a little bit of attention. And so when we're fatigued, working late hours, sometimes when we're taking medications that impair our consciousness, or even having stress and distractions in our lives, or even just in the environment, that can derail and cause some fragments in some of the wiring here that you need to make decisions via System 2. And this is very intentional and very energy dependent. And so all that's going to favor us kind of winging it, making intuitive decisions. And so sometimes that's fine in the case where there's expertise and there's familiar patterns that we're recognizing. But at the same time, if we're overconfident about our area of our knowledge and it's not appropriate to use intuition, this can be really problematic. So what might be a healthy balance of both the strengths and the weaknesses of intuitive judgment? Well, one thing we could do is we can recognize that part of System 2 is actually monitoring System 1. So if we're aware that we're using System 1, we might be able to create some periods of stability in our patients, and this should give us a reminder, like, okay, let's go back and figure out how we made this decision, and perhaps let's just double check our work and our assumptions and make sure it's the right decision. So sometimes you can use System 1 and then number 2 as a backup. The other thing is just consider alternatives when making key decisions. If there's like a higher probability entity in the population that requires attention, we'll consider the most prevalent diagnoses and try to prove to yourself that it's not those. It's a good technique to also just say, hey, I think we might be wrong about this. What might be the right way? And that kind of empowers you and your team to think through other options and a little bit more openly, and you might end up at a better solution by actually just going through that kind of activity. The other thing that expertise and kind of intuition requires is actually calibration and making sure that when you do make some decisions, you make sure that they're appropriate. And so when you're done with a rotation or a shift, going back and talking to others that have taken over for you later on and just double check some of the decisions you made and see if they are perhaps the more appropriate decisions were made by others, and try to understand how you got there and how they got there to their decisions. And certainly autopsies are a good way of calibrating some of our decisions on diagnosis. And actually participating in simulation activities can help too, in the sense that with simulated disasters, like, it's created under the model of something that's known. Like, you don't just like turn on the machine and it creates sepsis. You program parameters that are consistent with that. And so one has an opportunity to look at what were the barriers and facilitators for actually recognizing the pattern of disease, and then again, was the treatment in accordance with that? And so that actually can kind of help calibrate you for diagnosis. So, why should we care about this? Well, I think awareness of unconscious biases can certainly help explain the desired outcomes, but it also gives us a vocabulary for understanding decisions that we make and maybe others we make, and other decisions that others make, and gives you a way of trying to kind of understand the basis of some of the judgments that are made. Looking at decision-making frameworks and thinking about what happened in COVID, it's kind of fun just to sort of speculate on the different things that might have happened. I like to think that our cognitive biases might have been exploited either deliberately or accidentally. And an example of this is some of the infodemic that happened along with the pandemic, where somebody gets an idea, it starts sparking a little bit of a Twitter feed. Next thing you know, it becomes news, and then we're giving everybody hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin when it turned out to be that was something that became unsafe. And before we can even evaluate the literature on it, it's part of the lay press. And in some ways, our hands are kind of tied to provide this because everybody thinks that this might be something good, and to deny it would be denying them bitter care. I don't think we had a very good information set where we could think very slowly about the problems and try to understand step by step what we should be doing. Instead, I think we're all very desperate. There's all sorts of information out there, and unfortunately we had, for better or worse, we had very rapid tools for information spread, and so I think we're all a little bit swayed by the latest case report, even though that might not have represented the best care paradigm. And a lot of our safety checks, kind of that system 2 looking over on system 1, were not operational. And I think a lot of the team base that we're used to having, where we talk about plans with multidisciplines, we have a lot of people participating in rounds, we have sometimes dissent over plans and the opportunity to give input and kind of reshape thinking, reshape planning. All that was broken down. We instead traveled in very small teams and just kind of wrote orders and went from patient to patient. And a lot of those safeguards, I think, that sometimes help us stay on the up and up weren't there. We talked about the patient having the COVID brain, hard to sedate, hard to cooperate with ventilators. I think we all had the COVID brain of our own sort. And I think, a lot of information overload, low quality information, publications that were published fast without peer review rather than slow, a lot of stuff coming out on preprint servers. All that turned out to be kind of nice as a way of spreading information, but at the same time, there just were not a lot of safety checks. And I think the quality and the filtering was incredibly low. And there's like no bundling of communication. It was like 24/7. You're always getting pinged. And so what does this do to you? It prevents you from reasoning your way through things. And instead, you're just kind of winging it based on intuition that really isn't that much grounded with experience. So I talked a little bit about some of the loss of team structure, and then fatigue probably affects our decisions and our actions as well. So this isn't set to be, meant to be a complete set, but just sort of a reflection on where we were in the last year and how that kind of maps out on some of the different decision-making pathways that I think everybody believed to underlie a lot of the thoughts and judgments that we make in the critical care. So hopefully it was fun to kind of learn about some of this, and definitely those who feel like they've had an interest sparked, here's some additional resources that are fun to look at. This is a book written for the lay press by Dan Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for heuristic and biases. One of his proteges, Richard Thaler, who founded the field of behavioral economics along similar lines, has written a book for the lay press. And I think Gary Klein is a great resource for kind of the value of intuitive decision making. And here's some other classic articles too.